We are incredibly excited to be here with you to kick off SRECon. And while there's only going to be two of us up here on stage, this talk is really the results of some efforts between four of us. Dr. Zara Mirmalek, who's an ethnographic researcher with NASA studying space operations and deep sea exploration, was part of the conversations, as well as Laura Nolan, who is a principal SRE with Stanza Systems. She's had an illustrious SRE career with many of the biggest names in tech, and you're going to get to hear from her a little bit later in this conference as well.
She's also sitting right there.
She is sitting right over there. And so we came together over the course of about 4 months. We came together to compare and contrast our perspectives, our ideas, to debate, and to talk about what does this mean to the work of SREs and to the future of SRE. And we landed on the topic of knowledge and power. And so you might kind of think, what does this have to do with my work? But as Francis Bacon said in 1597, knowledge itself is power. And so that could be understood as those who have the knowledge have the power to be able to control the events. And so we were really questioning, is this actually true for software systems? Is this true for yourselves as SREs? And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So by way of introduction, I wanted to tell a little bit of a story about the first accident investigation I ever conducted as a safety professional. And I was working in a forestry operation in northern Canada, and I got a call that one of our forestry supervisors had flipped a four-wheel vehicle over onto himself, and he had crushed his pelvis, and he'd sustained substantial internal injuries, and we required a helicopter evacuation. And in the aftermath of that accident, I reconstructed the events of that day. I interviewed a number of the workers that were there. I looked at our maintenance records for the vehicles. I looked at the practices around logging and forestry operations. Why did we even decommission these roads so that we had to have these four-wheel vehicles in the first place? And what I found was what could have easily been dismissed as, well, this guy was rushing. You know, he had too many boxes on this thing and he was rushing. And so it was simply a case of human error. What I actually found was a much more complex and understandable story of what happened that day and why we had one of the most serious accidents of our company's history. And so, you know, his day had been delayed because of a flat tire. You know, he had a lot of production pressure to get things going during that day. We had these vehicles that had operating constraints on them. They kind of were built for our environment, but not really. And we had the logging companies which created these deactivations so that they could save money on road maintenance, and so they could limit access to the cut blocks. And so each one of these factors by themselves would not have been significant enough to have created this accident. But when they came together, this confluence of factors kind of created this situation that resulted in us having this helicopter evacuation. And so there's a couple of reasons why I tell this story. The first is that it's easy in the aftermath of an incident, whether that's on a logging site or whether that's, you know, in the log files of your work world. It's easy to dismiss these kinds of things and say, oh, that person made a mistake. And to say from a position of incredulousness, how could they have done that? Instead of from a position of inquiry saying, how could they have done that? And the second reason why I tell this story is because it brings to light to me this confluence of factors that is the system of work surrounding us. So we operate within production-pressured environments. We often have goal conflicts. We have multiple pressures and constraints that are on us when we are operating at sort of the front line or, hands-on keyboard. And so this perspective, this systems perspective, has served me not only in the last 15 years of my career as a safety and risk professional working in very high risk, high consequence type environments, but also in my work as a cognitive systems engineer, doing research for Jelly, and previously, doing research at the Ohio State University snafu catchers environment. And what I saw when I was working in these environments, that whether you are on a logging site or whether you are, hands on a keyboard, a lot of the same cognitive mechanisms, the way we think about work, the way we understand change that's happening, the way we interpret that, the way we bring others in to help our efforts, that coordination aspect, those are consistent across all of these kinds of domains. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is why we see a lot of what you do as being very high value work and high consequence work for society and for some of the critical digital infrastructure that we run in the world. So that is me. I will pass it to my colleague.
All right, so my sort of incident investigation origin story is not quite as extreme as yours. But before I do that, just to make sure everyone's awake, by show of hands, can you raise your hand if you've worked on a system where something filled up? So basically, like, something consumed like all the storage on a disk, or a cache got full, or like a database had too many records, and a lot of that data was actually stale, right? So if a cleanup script had been run at some point in advance, then that wouldn't have happened. How many? All right.
That's a lot of hands.
All right, now how many people have seen a cleanup script behave in ways that wasn't expected and go like run away and delete things it wasn't supposed to? All right. Just out of curiosity, how many people put up their hand both times? All right. Okay. I'm in the right room then. So these are the paradoxes that we always face here in SRE. So my sort of formative incident investigation that sticks out in my mind happened when I was at Netflix. I'd been there for about a year. I'm there now. So I started out in academia and then went into industry. I've always been a software engineer, but I've always been sort of interested in operations stuff. And I got hired onto the Chaos team, and I see this email go by about an outage that had happened in another part of the organization. So it was the team that owns a service that figures out what ads to show people. Now, this was 6 or 7 years ago. This is not like, today Netflix is going to start selling ads, but back then we did not sell ads, but we bought ads, right? So you'd see ads on like, YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And Netflix tried to do like personalization to figure out like what the right ad is to show someone, so they'll be interested in the content. They do A/B tests to figure out which model works best. And one day I see this email that like the system went down for a few hours, so they had to show unpersonalized ads as a fallback, right? So this is like effectively no customer impact that anyone would notice. We showed basically, less effective ads, I guess, for a few hours. But I really wanted to know what happened. So the email said that what the failure mode was that they had published new data that they were consuming for this to run this A/B testing, and there was a schema change, and they had pushed that data before they pushed the code, right? So I'm sure people have seen this, right? Like, new data schema, old code, it breaks. But like, I saw that, and this is not like considered an incident at Netflix, no customer impact, so no like sort of centralized investigation. But I was like, what happened there? So I went and I just started talking to the people that were involved, and like so many different factors came out of that. So one of them was that they had run a canary to test the code. So we do canarying in Netflix, some services do, and the canary had failed, which had prevented the new code from going out, but the failure was a false positive. It had happened that like the canary and the baseline had received different kinds of traffic, so the metrics had been different. So like something that was designed to actually, provide availability contributed to breaking it. And then there was, let me see my notes here. Another problem was that there's a lot of schedule pressure in this case. So this to set up these like A/B tests for their ML models for ads, they had to collaborate across 3 different teams. They had to like schedule when that test was going to run, and then they had a time window. And that time window got compressed because it took longer for the data scientists to develop the model than they anticipated. Usually they would do more end-to-end testing, but because of the compressed schedule, they had to just deploy it, and it broke. And also, there was a tooling issue in that it was actually a pain in the butt to schedule these tests. The tooling was kind of difficult to use for when you were going to say when this A/B test would run. So there was like a disincentive on the engineers to postpone that test because there was a lot of manual work that was involved. But one of the factors that I found really interesting, and I think is relevant really here, is that right before this incident, they had migrated the pipeline that was used to generate the model from like an older workflow management system to a newer one. And when they did that migration to the new workflow management system, they had missed a wait state in the pipeline. So the data went out, was published before it was supposed to. Now, the person who wrote that original pipeline with the wait state had left Netflix, right? And so that knowledge had effectively left the organization, and that was one of the contributors to this incident. So I found that all really fascinating, and I think that like that is a particular kind of knowledge that we care about, right? It's very domain specific, right? This is not the kind of knowledge we talk about that's like, in a book that you would read, but there's all different kinds of knowledge we want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point that you make there is an interesting one as well, is that we often look at these things and we only look at them typically when there has been incidents, because we don't have time to look at normal work. We don't have time to look at everyday operations. But these kinds of things are a part of everyday operations. And so people leaving the organization, people coping with a lot of complexity, with a lot of uncertainty, with a lot of unexpected, unanticipated problems, and often coping with them in ways that mean they resolve them and no one notices. This is the stuff of normal work.
Yeah, and a lot of the knowledge that we get is by doing, right? Now, I think like all fields are really like that, but in in SRE in particular, I mean, the way we get better at it is one by actually doing it, right? By getting experience doing this operations work in the systems that we're working with. We learn how to use the tooling. We learn how to recognize what certain symptoms look like. And also, there's that knowledge that we get just by being around people who are really good at operations. So where I work, but at every organization, right, there are people who are really, really good. And if you have the chance to sort of sit next to them and watch what they do, you can absorb a tremendous amount of knowledge about expertise about how they work. So I was for a while on the centralized SRE team, which is called the core team, and those engineers there would be able to do amazing things with the internal observability tooling to figure out what was going on, and it really, really impressed me, and I took a lot away from that when I switched teams to other teams, and then I could actually spread okay, here's how you use our telemetry system to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, so from a technical perspective, as you say, when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about the facts, the information, the skills that you have gained, either through that formal education or through your informal sort of on-the-job training. But in a world like SRE, that is very underspecified. Many people working often within the same team have very different knowledge sets. They have a variety of experiences and skills, obviously, and a very fundamental aspect of thinking about knowledge in this kind of domain and in a lot of complex adaptive type systems is that everyone's knowledge is going to be partial and incomplete in some way. So that's a really fundamental point, because it means that you shouldn't be expected to know everything, that you have to work across people. You have to bring together multiple diverse sets of knowledge and skills and experience to be able to do the kinds of work that you do in continuously changing environments. And so that fundamental piece of everyone's knowledge is going to be partial and incomplete is also kind of partnered with this other understanding of how we think about cognition in these kinds of worlds. And that is that your knowledge, once it kind of goes into your head, is your ability to get it out of your head is directly related to how it went in there. So we talk about this in terms of knowledge storage. So when you learned something, did you learn it in a way that makes it easy for you to retrieve, easy for it to be activated when you're in a situation and the cues start to tell you, oh, this is like this other thing that I've seen? Or when you learned it, did it become sort of its own compartmentalized way or its own compartmentalized knowledge set that is very hard in the heat of an incident or, in a very intense discussion about what kind of monitoring to set up or how to architect the system, you can't pull that out. So this other aspect of knowledge is that activation, the ability to activate it is very important. It can be inert, so you can know something and not be able to use it in the moment, and that it can go stale. And this is very much a part of your world in continuous deployment, continuous integration environments, is that you have to be continually learning, you have to be continually updating your mental model of your system for that knowledge to be relevant. And so as we continue to talk about the incidents, that piece is going to be really fundamental for this discussion.
Yeah. So, one of the challenges for us to understand how this sort of knowledge gets into people's heads and what people know, to really do this well means doing qualitative analysis, right? You cannot capture people's knowledge through metrics on your system. You need to actually draw it out of them, and it's a skill and it's a challenge, right? So one of the things that I am always really interested in when I look at incidents, and both Laura and I are generally pretty interested in incident analysis, and so that's kind of the lens that we're using here for studying how people do some of this SRE work. To draw that out really involves doing qualitative kind of work where you are talking to people that were involved and getting them to talk through how they knew what they knew, which is a little tricky because people generally don't know how they know things. And so you have to kind of tease it out of them. And often you have to sort of walk them through it. So in particular, one of the nice ways that incidents are useful for studying how SREs are able to do their work effectively is that it's this sort of flashpoint thing, right? It's a very intense kind of thing. It gives you a wedge to go in and do some study. Whereas if you just sort of say tell me what your work is like, it's way too vague, right? So you can go and you can say, okay, you were paged. All right, now do you remember at that moment what was going through your head, and then where did you look next? How did you know to look there? You can talk through people and you can get them to discuss what they know and how they know it that way. And one of the challenges I find is that if you don't do this, if you don't elicit it this way, people never volunteer it. So I have read a lot of incident write-ups that were done by the team that was involved, and they will say after some investigation, blah blah we found blah 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 blah, and I'm always well, what was that investigation? What did you, how did you figure that out? And people they don't want, oh, I looked here first and that was a red herring. But actually you're using a strategy, a heuristic there that's actually useful most of the time. And it was not, even though in this particular case it wasn't useful, in general it is. And people don't realize that that's really useful for other people in the organization to see how you're doing things. And so they want to describe, okay, what happened to the system, and they're not used to thinking about how it is that they're doing their work. And I know, Laura, that you spend a lot of time studying how people actually deal with incidents in the moment.
Yeah, and I think the point that you're making there in the sense of why we go deep on something like an incident is because when we look at that and sort of say, oh, it was because Jim made a mistake, or because Jim failed to notice that, that things were trending poorly and failed to act appropriately, we lose this opportunity to actually update our knowledge, to learn something about why was Jim's attention directed in this way and not in this way. What else was going on for Jim? If it wasn't Jim, if it was, Sarah or Jill or whoever, would they have made the same choices? Would they have taken the same actions? And so this ability to go deep on incidents helps us to unpack kind of the conditions, the system of work, and start looking at the realities of everyday operational environments.
I want to say, so one of my favorite examples of this is I'm sitting and listening to people talk through like after an incident happened, and they have like the timeline there, and I look and it's like 2 minutes between like when like impact happened and when they figured out what the problem was, and I asked the SRE, like, how did you figure that out? How did you figure out it was like service X? And he's like, oh, I went to like the is it X dashboard, right? And like they actually had. They have like a whole set of dashboards, like is it service X, is it service Y, is it service Z? Like they've seen a number of common failure modes from certain kinds of services that can have significant impact, and they saw that symptom, and they're like, oh, that symptom is typically service X. I'm going to go verify that, and they did that really quickly. And so they had, so in a sense that dashboard is a kind of like encoded expertise, but you have to know when to go look at it, right? Mm-hmm. And like, yeah, you could build like and it is a large dashboard with many, many different things on it, but you have to know which one to check first. And that combination of like spending that effort to like encode, to make it easier to figure out, to diagnose based on like a common pattern, and knowing when to look at that are both, really important skills, and that really compresses the time it took to deal with that particular incident.
Yeah, and those are the details that matter, obviously. When we think about, accidents in high-risk, high-consequence type environments, people aren't making, and similar with your own world, is people aren't making decisions in this quiet room where there's no other demands on their time, there's nobody bothering them, they have all the time in the world to think things through, all the information is available to them, the information is never changing, it's never, there and then gone, or difficult to interpret in the moment. No. We work in the messy, real world where people are coming in, you've got multiple other demands on your time that you're trying to reprioritize while you're trying to diagnose or stem stop the bleeding, so to speak. And so these kinds of tacit knowledge, the thing that you do without thinking about it, or the place that you go often, without conscious thought, those are the things that we need to pull out, that we need to extract, and we need to start distributing across the teams, because that's the stuff that matters under time pressure and uncertainty and under conditions of extreme stress in a lot of cases. And so when we bring these things out in incidents, these aspects of normal work, and we start to distribute them across the teams, we then can start looking at the macro cognition. We can start looking at, okay, how do we more effectively bring together the right people at the right points in time to be able to make the most of these multiple diverse perspectives that we have within our team. And one of the things that we talked about a lot in our conversations with Zara and Laura is this idea that increasingly with microservice architecture and different forms of organizing the work, these are not only intra-organizational coordination that has to happen with people that you might have seen in the lunchroom, or you might have worked together on a few projects. You have some level of common ground, common understanding. This is often spanning intra-organizational boundaries. So now we're starting to work with people we don't know. We have zero idea of what their knowledge or their skill sets are. And we have little understanding of what is their orientation to the problem, what is their priorities of the goals that they have in trying to work together. And so this makes this kind of work much more complex and much more difficult. But when we start to do this deeper analysis and we start to be able to surface where knowledge lives within your organization, you're able to coordinate much more smoothly under these conditions of uncertainty and time pressure and stress, and you're able to bring the full knowledge of your organization or of the group that you're working with to bear in real time.
So there's a difference, I'll say unfortunately, because I'm an IC, between like the folks who have like the deepest knowledge, I would say, about like how the system works and stuff, and then the people who, make the actual decisions about like what happens at a larger scale, right? So that's like the power part. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the power. And for me, one aspect of that is influence. Is like, how are you able to? One of the things I think we all want to do, certainly something I want to do is have influence over like what happens in my organization. And that is a very challenging thing. And just because you're like an expert in your domain does not mean that you have the ability to make like changes in your organization. And so, one of the challenges is, regardless of what you think of, management, they, like us, are what we call like locally rational. They have a finite number of hours in the day, just like we do, and most of that time is honestly, they're in meetings, right? And they can only pay attention to one thing at a time, right? Just like us, we can all only focus on one thing at a time. And so their entire worldview is shaped by like what they see and what they pay attention to, right? And so one of the ways we can actually have potentially influence on that is to try to help like shape that view of their world. And one of the challenges is that our systems are large and messy, as Laura was alluding to, and like that's very difficult for someone to like absorb, right? There's just like our systems are very large. Everyone is doing stuff that like we can't see, and so to make sense of it, people have to compress the information, right? They want to make it easy to figure out what is going on with the system in order to make decisions. And so that's where I think you see this I almost say like trap of being really tempted to use certain kinds of metrics to understand what is going on in the system to help make decisions. And I think that like I'm going to point to Laura Nolan there, made a specific comment in our discussions about sort of the trap of shallow metrics. But you can see the temptation, right? Because like it's easy to look at metrics and help make decisions. It is much harder to look at sort of a wide swath of what we call weak signals and integrate those like holistically and figure out like what to actually do.
Yeah, so I agree, and we agreed for the most part in our conversations about this idea that everyone within the system, regardless of where you sit in the hierarchy, has pressures and constraints in their jobs. They have limitations to what they can and can't do. And people in positions of power and influence have an inherent responsibility to people that they manage and people who they may be putting increased pressure and constraints on their work to really understand the implications of that. When I was working in an energy distribution company several years ago, I was leading a training for a group of executives, and I said, when you ask your teams to cut the budget by 15% and to move the schedule up by a month, how do you expect they actually do that? What do they do to make that happen? And one of the executives who was I had a lot of respect for her. She was actually like, I don't know. They just make it happen. They're good at their jobs. They make it happen. But what that does is all of that pressure, the reprioritization, the reconfiguration, the reallocation of resources, and the redistribution of people oftentimes in order to meet those objectives creates pressure. And it creates a lot of conflict for people in lower levels within the organization. And so as part of our conversation, we talked a lot about like, how do we help sort of recognize that every node in this system that we're looking at has its own sharp end, it has its own pressures and constraints that are being placed on it, and it has this responsibility to really deeply understand the work and the pressures that may be placed. So this emphasis on metrics is one way of kind of coping with this complexity, but investing in the kinds of understandings and the kinds of mechanisms that you can use, like incident analysis, like giving people time and space to have a bit of a hot wash or to help sense make after an incident or after a particularly troubling event. Not just in a cursory, yeah, we all got to do retros kind of way, but what was going on? What were you dealing with? What were you trading off? Where were your priorities? Where were you reprioritizing and revising? Where is the hidden amount of pressure that you feel in your job? Let's surface that. Let's start to see it so we can really understand how the system functions.
So let me see if folks are still awake. How many folks work in organizations where you have to, where they use OKRs? How many people use OKRs? Yeah, that's a good chunk. So for those who aren't familiar with OKRs, it's objectives and key results. The idea there is that management will set objectives that they want to hit. They will define some kind of measure for determining whether you've hit that objective or not, and then they'll set some kind of threshold, right, to see whether or not like you hit that. And I'll say, like in my organization, one of the challenges is that so we have OKRs that we use, like I'm on the managed delivery team at Netflix. We build a deployment tool that's used internally by other engineers, and we have to push features out, and we got to move people onto our new system, and there's OKRs around that. But all the reliability work ends up as keep the lights on, like KTLO. There's this like bucket of like non-OKR stuff that you're just expected to do, and if you don't do it, then it's going to be bad. But if you do it and if you prioritize it over the OKR stuff, well, it's just going to show up that you didn't hit your OKRs, right? And so the fact that the reliability work is not explicitly captured in an OKR, and the fact that OKRs are used to assess how teams are doing, like affects the prioritization exactly in that way. It pushes us to prioritize the work that is most visible, and to shrink the stuff that we want to do, but and we're going to take on more risk if we don't do it, but is not as visible to the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Laura had brought up this really good point about, and I think Daria mentioned it in the opening comments as well, is that SREs are systems thinkers. And so, a good sort of SRE is thinking about looking beyond the KPIs, like acknowledging the costs of on-call. They're correctively incentivizing and thinking about the necessity for creating this space to be thinking beyond the numbers and surfacing this understanding of normal work so that we can all be continually updating our knowledge. And so we have a better understanding of whose knowledge matters at what points in time, and can we bring them in and make use of that knowledge in real time. So
we don't have that much time left, so I want to talk a little bit about the future, since that's one of the themes here. And I'm going to say a little bit about the future from my perspective in my organization. And so what I see in my organization is there's a big push within the platform engineering organization to do more, to manage more stuff for the engineers who own services, right? Like today they have to deal with all the low-level AWS constructs, deal with security groups, and they have to configure like load balancer rules and stuff like that, and they don't like to do that, and I understand that. And so there's a push to increase the level of abstraction. To have the platform teams provide higher abstractions, manage more infrastructure for them. But the challenge is that's less work for them when things are working well. But when things break, all of a sudden the system's a lot more complex. There's multiple layers. They have to interact between the platform team and the service team that owns the service. It's sort of like a shared operational responsibility. And also the service teams are now not doing as much operations work by design, right? And the problem is that operations is like a muscle. And so what I personally worry about a lot for the future in my organization is that we are going to have fewer incidents, but they're going to be a lot more complex to deal with, and people are going to be in not as good a position to deal with it because they're not going to have as much experience.
Yeah. So I think we opened this conversation by talking about, like, is knowledge power? And what are the implications for that for software systems? And I think that it is really important for us collectively to be asking those questions, and to consider what those implications are for software. We are increasingly running the critical infrastructure of society on software. And so your role as SREs, even if right now you're only just building cat memes, the cognitive work and the ways in which you coordinate and the ways in which you carry out your work, there are generalizable patterns that we can learn and see about how people do this, in increasingly high risk and critical infrastructure. And so as a cognitive system engineer who studies the way that you think and the way you do these things, I feel it's very imperative that we are making investments in understanding normal work. And so this is, creating opportunities to learn from incidents, surfacing, tacit knowledge, and helping people better coordinate across the systems that they're in.
So one thing I wanted to be a little, controversial maybe, and I wanted to make a claim, because we're talking about the future here. I wanted to claim that I did not think our industry was going to be regulated much more than it is today, like that there'll be regulations around like data that we continue to see, but really the kind of work that we do, I didn't think regulations were coming. And then I'm like looking at the conference program and I see there's this talk by Andrew Ellman about, oh yeah, regulations are coming, we're going to be regulated. So I'm not going to make that claim. I'm going to go listen to that talk and see see what Andrew has to say. But I wanted to bring this up because, Laura, you've worked in industries that are regulated and you've seen, the good and the bad aspects of it. And so I was interested.
Yeah, my default position, I suppose, would be to say that regulation is coming, that it will not be pretty because oftentimes regulatory environments or regulatory agencies lag behind where industry is at. So the innovation at the cutting edge is continually moving the bar and regulators are continually trying to catch up. And so that delta between sort of what the regulation says should be happening and what's actually happening at the front line can be, at best irritating and frustrating, and at worst it can be dangerous. And so my sense of regulation in software and for the future of SREs is that it is better to be self-led. It is better to be self-regulated, to be defining the ways in which your work should be controlled, your work should be understood by the broader society. I think that there's a parable that the American playwright David Foster Wallace talks about, and he says there's two fish that are out swimming, and there's an elder fish, kind of an older fish swimming towards them, and he swims by and says, "Morning, boys, water's fine," and the two fish kind of swim on, and after a few minutes, one of them looks to the other and says, "What the heck is water?" And so the point of that story is that the most important and obvious realities are the ones that are often hardest to see and to talk about. And so my hope for the future of SRE is that we continue to surface these kinds of things that are hard to see, and we continue to talk about them.
All right, any closing thoughts here?
I think I'm looking forward to an excellent conference, and I would love to continue the conversation with you all.
All right. So one thing I'll say is my call to action here is the next time you are looking in the wake of an incident, say, to think in terms of knowledge and power, in terms of understanding how the incident happened. Like, what is the knowledge that people had and how that affected how things unfolded, or what was the knowledge they didn't have? And don't just say, well, they should have known that. Like, look and understand like how knowledge actually gets transmitted through the organization. Thank you. Enjoy the
Thank you
conference.
very much.